Good morning. It's October the 24th, 2010, and we're at the Sunday morning sessions. And it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Father Ed Ondrako. I've known Father Ed for, 5 or 6 years anyway. He and I had many adventures together, and he's going to be speaking to us today on intuition and certitude. Newman and Scotus anticipate liberal Christianity and modern voluntarism.
Thank you, Dr. Newman. One of our greatest trips together was to Fatima when he gave a superb paper on Mary, and we had much to talk about heart as heart speaks to heart. The précis. L'intuition est un flamboiement de certitude qui déchire la nuit des sens. Intuition is a blaze of certitude which tears the night of the senses. Intuition is at work in the familiar epitaph on the tombstone chosen by Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, out of the shadows and images to the truth. The two quotes are part of the many strands that link the Oxford Plato's thought patterns with those of Blessed John Duns Scotus. The quotes reflect a language of faith which develops in a community of faith as a living reality. There is certainty about how to engage the relationship between faith and reason, a certainty that cannot be silenced at will. The common root in their thought patterns is about intuition and the rapport between necessity and contingency. Necessity is something that cannot be other than it is. Contingency is something that may or may not happen. Necessity is in relation to the infinite or uncreated, and contingency is in relation to the finite or created. Applicable to this manner of thinking, Blessed Scotus' univocity of the concept of being is a unique formulation to keep logic linked to reality. And Blessed Newman's illative sense is integrally connected to the thought of Blessed Scotus and Saint Bonaventure. Blessed Scotus, more than his predecessors, unites metaphysics and theology, each science leaning on the other to exist. From this foundation, our thesis is being constructed that Blessed Scotus is a progenitor of Blessed Newman, the whole purpose of why we began together 2 days ago. Blessed Scotus lived at a time when there was more of a synthesis of faith and reason, a harmony in the relationship between philosophical and theological thought patterns. Blessed Newman lived after the Reformation had begun with the rebellion of clerics and nobles and following the modern outgrowth of the Enlightenment. That outgrowth, part of modernity, is often characterized by a splitting of the intelligible harmony between faith and reason. The unfortunate result for the 21st century is a growing perception that modernity is rigged, meaning that it's not in favor of Christianity. For example, there are opponents to many sides to the Christian tradition of the existence and immortality of the soul. However, not all is gloom if one understands and learns from Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman how to interpret and be faithful to the Church's teachings, her perennial wisdom, and what it means to be a person. Although in a weakened existential condition, human beings are inclined toward transcendence, possessing unlimited causal power, potential, and freedom. The hypothesis about Blessed Scotus as progenitor of Blessed Newman involves a decisive invitation to objective and scholarly interpretation, and is not merely an appeal for the barren repetition of ancient or medieval formulae. It's a hypothesis mindful that the Church and her scholars engage the methodological background of modernity, its philosophical or natural scientific standpoint, which has resulted in the change in the manner of conceiving the relationship of faith and reason. Our theologians recognize the importance of teaching about the inner unity of the history of faith. This noble quest for inner unity and certitude finds support from properly using the tools of Blessed Scotus, such as intuitive and abstractive cognition. And Dr. Noon led us in that careful distinction the day before yesterday. And using the tools of Blessed Newman, such as real and notional apprehension and assent. And Dr. Ford has led us in that careful distinction, just as Father Peter tried to link the two together and to clarify. Now, reconstruction and interpretation, the modes of rationality, historical, philosophical, theological, and anthropological, demonstrate the continuity and tradition of particular themes, such as intuition and certitude, in living the Christian faith. The goal is not to use these methods to reconstruct the theological themes. The problem of reconstruction came into prominence shortly after the Second Vatican Council. And here's where I find the view of Pope Benedict XVI to be helpful in clarifying that historical method has its proper role, but can be misused to distill what he calls the pure quintessence of the past, instead of demonstrating a trustworthy continuum, which is tradition. The Holy Father sees the problem as historical reconstruction on its own, unable to visualize faith in its pure state. And we saw that faith in the witness of Deacon Jack Sullivan. Not a one of us doubted his faith and the purity of that faith in his words to us, an example. If one desires to remove what is theological from every philosophical formulation, then philosophical reason alone is unable to play a decisive role in the quest for truth. And Pope Benedict is saying that Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman intuited in the quest for truth, for understanding the development of doctrine, there are strengths and limits to using historical method and of importing philosophy into faith. The absence of the cautious eye that Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman have toward history, philosophy, theology, and anthropology runs the risk of relativism in living the Christian faith. We heard many examples of that worry and that concern about relativism. Blessed Newman and Blessed Scotus contribute to the balance that the Holy Father desires and to the peaceful resolution of the development of doctrine and inherent tensions felt between what is inseparable, that is, interpretation and fidelity to the fundamental truths of the Catholic faith. When he was Archbishop of Munich and Freising, Pope Benedict replied gently to the spiritual upheaval of our age, quote, "Only the person who makes the truth accessible once again, who actually mediates it, remains true to it, but only the one who remains true to it and interprets it correctly. An interpretation that is unfaithful ceases to be a genuine interpretation and becomes a falsification." Unquote. The works of Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman demonstrate that they intuited the Holy Father's caveat and remain true to the purpose of genuine interpretation and fidelity to fundamental truths of the Catholic faith. The works of the two great English scholars, separated by 5 centuries, demonstrate a progressive illumination, if you would, and realization of God's most perfect love. They interpret the supreme love and goodness and mercy of God correctly, regardless of sin and suffering, a truth Blessed Newman experienced in his early days as a curate. Pastoral care taught him what Blessed Scotus demonstrates, that it is unreasonable to claim sin as the necessary premise for the realization of salvific love. Rather, the Franciscan answers, and we got a very strong reflection from Sister Mary Beth Ingham last evening in the keynote address, underscoring the Franciscan answer. The Franciscan answers that it is recognition of love that is willing to suffer and to become incarnate in order to suffer, that is the correct answer, the slow-paced truth Blessed Newman was discovering, a truth that permeates his writings. Blessed Scotus teaches that Christ might have redeemed us in any number of ways, simply by being born. He freely chose the cross, and that his love would have been as great, even if he had not chosen the cross. And the considerable similarity in their thought patterns on this hierarchical truth is obvious. So it's no surprise that in his beatification homily, the Holy Father mentions Blessed Scotus specifically when he names Blessed Newman as worthy to take his place in the long line of saints and scholars from these islands. In Blessed John Henry, that tradition of gentle scholarship, deep human wisdom, and profound love for the Lord has borne rich fruit as a sign of the abiding presence of the Holy Spirit deep within the heart of God's people, bringing forth abundant gifts. Now, are we more at home with Scotus or with Kant? The short answer is that never before Scotus had the distinction between the abstraction and intuition been so firm. The longer answer is that Scotus fine-tuned the metaphysics of Aristotle with his study of the transcendentals and showed that theology requires metaphysics to be pushed to its final end in order to exhaust its possibilities. Such a push is worth it because to drive metaphysics to attain its final end is to permit access to beatitude. Shortcuts do not work. The absence of a firm distinction between abstraction and intuition is the danger of the blurring of boundaries by uncritical thinking. The main difficulty is that this blurring of boundaries gave way to the generation of ideas that focuses on contours of self, a new pattern or type, that of liberal Christianity. What may be seductively deceptive is that this modern pattern or type is built on an anti-holiness principle. That is an irreconcilable contradiction to living the gospel for Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman. Now let's apply the lens of Blessed Scotus to a crucial but often overlooked historical development. If one examines the development of this new pattern or type in the structure of the relation between metaphysics and theology, between the time of St. Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant, one has to include the thought of Francisco Suarez. For all of his contributions, the rethinking of earlier problems by Suarez in the late humanistic and Renaissance culture demonstrates that Suarez is an eclectic and closer to St. Thomas than Blessed Scotus. Now, according to Olivier Boulnois, the Kantian achievement is largely guided by the Suarezian tradition of metaphysics. This is a compelling point. Beyond the preliminary scope of this essay, but worthy of further study, for in fact the discussion did come up with Professor Noon yesterday. Here is where I join the chorus of those who hold that it seems that Blessed Newman intuited something wrong in the Kantian achievement, and that this intuition was there very early in his Oxford career. The felt difficulty motivated his lifelong quest, which resulted in his inimitable synthesis about certitude, the grammar of assent, which was echoed in his acceptance speech upon being named a cardinal in 1879. Now, the grounding. A close reading of Blessed Scotus will unfold a panorama of reasons, and we have been doing that for the last 2 days. A panorama of reasons why he may be called a progenitor of Blessed Newman and not of Kant. And I'm persuaded that Blessed Newman's writings convey an intuition that metaphysics is not a laicization of theology, and that theology does not govern the development of metaphysics. This is strikingly evident in his definition of the essence of a university. Blessed Newman's idea of a university is replete with his understanding of the autonomy of metaphysics and indispensable interdependence with theology. The autonomy was never argued with as much conviction and clarity prior to Blessed Scotus and in a new form by Blessed Scotus. The subtle doctor inherited a short synthesis from St. Bonaventure, the reductio artium ad theologiam, the reduction or the return of the arts to theology, which has many similarities to what the Oxford Plato, Newman, holds as the essence of a university and the role of theology in a liberal education. That is why, in terms of logic, ontology, and natural theology, recentered around a Kantian onto-theology focus, there's a gap that needs critical thought, lest one fall into the trap of binding theology and metaphysics from accomplishing their respective goals or tasks. Onto-theology is a peculiar separation of faith and reason, which brings confusion into the argument for the existence of God from reason, such as that of Blessed Scotus, and from conscience, such as that of Blessed Newman. Said another way, the anti-holiness principle has many strands. They are anticipated by Blessed Scotus. They are consciously avoided by Blessed Newman. If both Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman are properly understood, they help counter the darkness of contemporary skepticism about ontology or being, and the cynicism that comes from it. Oh, it's that cynicism that is so difficult for me sometimes to live with. Theirs is the blueprint for right reason in true liberty of will and intellect. Pope Benedict knows the negative attitude toward the study of being, or ontology, which he said seems to counter the function and act-centered thinking of theological thought since the Council. He defends the study of ontology and dismisses the view that ontology is unacceptable. The way that shift in emphasis plays out in the study of theology is that ontological thought is perceived or dismissed as static, one that ought to be replaced by the historical and dynamic approach of Scripture. The Holy Father recognizes this rejection of the ontological as a counterposition to the dialogical and personal, instead of incorporating them together as a valid method of research. So if one looks for a concise answer to his worry, I submit that in his papal audience on July 7th, 2010, there he sets the table for dialogue with ontological and anthropological considerations to answer the challenges of using right reason in true liberty of will and intellect. Now, why is this answer important to the Holy Father? A Scotistic reply is, what is at stake is access to beatitude, which is experienced by the blessed and accessible in glimpses by the intuition of an ordered, finite intellect that desires union with the truth. That is what's at stake. We lay our lives down for that. Take note of his papal addresses to teachers and to students in the United Kingdom recently. The gravity of these truths is implied by a pastor who is catechizing. And he knows he's not only catechizing the United Kingdom, but that all are listening around the world. He invites teachers to form the human person, to equip him or her to live life to the full, which is to impart eternal wisdom to the young. He invites the young people to become saints and explains that the key is very simple. True happiness is to be found in God. Only God can satisfy the deepest needs of our hearts. As you come to know God better, you find you want to reflect something of His infinite goodness in your own life. All the work you do in your Catholic schools is placed in the context of growing in friendship with God, and all that flows from that friendship. The young heard the Holy Father. They responded with great energy, affirmatively. Holy Father, we want to be saints. Such a powerful response from the young people standing in front of the cathedral in London, Westminster Cathedral. Now, there are three caveats that I would propose when studying modern voluntarism and liberal Christianity. The first caveat has to do with identifying three helpful but competing ways of thinking about development in metaphysics. Olivier Boulnois traces three ways of thinking about metaphysics from the 13th century, what he calls the evolutionary structure of metaphysics to Kant. The first he identifies as that of Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas. The second, Roger Bacon, Giles of Rome, and others. And the third, Caesar of Brabant, Henry of Ghent, Augustine of Ancona, Peter of Trabes, Alexander of Alexandria, and Blessed Scotus. In other words, there are several ways of thinking about metaphysics reflected by individuals with differing views. Boulnois places Blessed Scotus in the third approach to the development in metaphysics. Now, in the quest for finding contours in the thought between Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman, there are three major approaches to studying the will in relation to the intellect, outlined by Father Peter Damian Fellner, and we got an indication of this in his two presentations and summary. The first is that of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. The second, for the sake of argument, is that of Occam, Hume, and Kant. And the third, that of St. Bonaventure, Blessed Scotus, and what we're arguing and how we're building an argument, that of Blessed Newman. Now, whether one follows Father Peter or Boulnois, both recognize the problem of splitting ontology and theology. One effect of the split has a bearing on the birth and development of liberal Christianity, a birth that finds itself in the thought of John Locke. Now, the second caveat has to do with the somewhat daunting word onto-theology. Professor Noon addressed that a bit in his first lecture. Onto-theology, which means in practice, as I understand it, the detachment of revealed theology from philosophy. The word ontology developed as that branch of metaphysics that is the study of reality or being. Theology that is detached from revealed theology, in this case, means natural theology, or theology that is using the tools of reason alone, without revelation. And that is how onto-theology, detached from revelation, came into use as natural theology. And whatever the contributions of Kant, and we definitely don't want to just be critical of him, but whatever the contributions of Kant and the onto-theologians to the study of truth, Kant makes a recognizable change to the structural orientation of metaphysics to theology as it was perceived in the 13th century. Now, Father Peter has argued quite clearly, I think, and we have a lot more of his material that's to be published supporting this view. Kant inspired further onto-theological systems such as that of the thought of Hegel and Heidegger. Alan Wolter puts it this way to explain how far the onto-theology split in metaphysics is from Blessed Scotus. Quote, "The theory of transcendentals is not simply an important section of Scotus' metaphysics. It is his metaphysics, and like his metaphysics, it is saturated with theological implications," unquote, from Father Wolter. A part of the caveats. Although Hegel tried to correct some of Kant's thought, he replaces being with becoming, or change. And becoming means change, which means everything can change. And sometimes Blessed Newman is misinterpreted as saying that in his classic line in the Essay in the Aid of the Development of Doctrine. To live is to change. Not what Cardinal Newman meant. So the heart of the difficulty is that onto-theology replaces being with material or formal logic. That's a major contemporary problem. And one has to be alert to the seductive thought of neo-Hegelian sympathizers since Vatican II. Pope Benedict XVI gently dismisses neo-Hegelian thought as misleading. An example is in dealing with the problem of suffering. Without intuitive metaphysical resources, there is a strong temptation to explain the mystery of suffering and evil by anthropomorphizing God and confusing the mystery of the Trinity to the extent that false comfort is given to the human person in pilgrimage. Cyril O'Regan from Notre Dame elucidates this difficulty with Hegel, and I quote, "Hegel provides the template for a suffering God within a Trinitarian horizon," unquote. And of course, Professor O'Regan takes issue with that Hegelian view. Now, Blessed Scotus answers in plain words. God as God cannot suffer. The subtle doctor clarifies that suffering and becoming are not pure perfections in Scotistic terminology there. Becoming is not being. The pure perfections, including being, freedom, will, intellect, love, and knowledge, take precedence over becoming and experience. It's that emphasis on experience alone that is the difficulty with Hume. We were engaging that a bit in some of the doctoral work of one of our participants here, Alec Plato. Now, suffering is a contingency in personal life in finite human beings. It's not suffering in the divine nature, which is impossible, but suffering in the sacred humanity of Christ that changes human suffering from punishment for sin to the manifestation of the Father's love for our salvation. And that is why Blessed Scotus taught that God can never predestine anyone to damnation, but all are predestined in Christ to share the glory of the Blessed Trinity. And Blessed Newman intuited this truth in his early days as an Anglican priest, and that's why he had to separate himself and distance himself from that earlier evangelical thought that tended to be heavily influenced by Calvinist predestinationism. Newman just couldn't take that anymore. It was too stifling. It took the air out of one's life. We're continuing with our caveats here. Although he wrote a qualifying dissertation on Blessed Scotus, Heidegger seems to have a fusion of medieval logic with neo-Kantianism and phenomenology. He was a contemporary of St. Edith Stein in Edmund Husserl's classes. While she broke away from neo-Kantianism, Heidegger does not seem to have made that same exit. And perhaps that's why Heidegger's polemic with theology is complex. I turn to Sean McGrath, who refers to Heidegger's theological moratorium that makes it very difficult to be open to new ways of being modern while not losing what it means to be an authentic person with human dignity. And this is another way of saying that Heidegger obscures the type or pattern of behavior of Christianity and its impression on its surroundings. Said in a nutshell, to alter the type corrupts the type. And that is the point Father Ford was making yesterday when he talked about Blessed Newman's theory on the development of doctrine, and then his essay on the development of doctrine, how the very first note, preservation of type, Newman took so long to sort that out, and in actual length when one reads it, that's why that is so long, and as those notes go along, the 7 of them, they get shorter and shorter. But to alter the type corrupts the type. So in contrast, the silence of the saint before the infinite chasm that separates the human person from God, finite being from infinite being, is the silence of humble contemplation before God. The key to understanding Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman, especially about the pure perfections of will, intellect, freedom, love, knowledge, that human beings share with God. Continue with our caveats. So the main worry is a risk of skepticism if one applies the logic of onto-theology to the extramental. And this means that the Onto-theology of Kant and Hegel and Heidegger separate faith from reason, snip faith from reason, if you want to put it in that image, or separate truths which are authentically present in the witness of the saints and martyrs, the fathers, St. Augustine, St. Anselm, St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman, separation from reality, being. Metaphysics of faith and freedom hold that God and the human person share the pure perfection of being in two modes, finite and infinite, including the pure perfections of will and intellect, freedom, love, and knowledge, and more. And continue with these caveats for one more paragraph here. Since voluntarism is usually taken to mean the study of the primacy of the will over the intellect, it's important to clarify whether it is a voluntarism from an ancient, a patristic, medieval, or modern perspective. Without distinguishing, the idea of voluntarism may misidentify the thought of Blessed Scotus on the will and intellect as a preparation for Kant's Onto-theology. And nothing could be farther from the truth about Blessed Scotus. Now, there's a failure of those distinctions, of those time periods, and the way the word is used, sort of that mixing up that Professor Newman warned us about, that people look back and try to blame Scotus for problems because the historical facts have been jumbled. It's that jumbling that is so far from the truth about Scotus. The erroneous corollary is to suggest that Blessed Scotus is a modernist, when he was accused of it, a temptation in some academic circles today. Father Peter gave us a few examples of that. Moreover, some scholars posit that Blessed Newman is a modernist. And certainly that was the difficulty with the interpretation of Weatherby and Lash that Father Peter delineated for us yesterday. So some scholars posit that Blessed Newman is a modernist, or one who, along with Blessed Scotus, prepared future generations to be modernists and voluntarists, meaning an arbitrary use of the will. And of course, that's Kant. Nothing could be farther from the truth in regard to Blessed Newman. And there's ample proof that Newman was intuitively uncomfortable with this Kantian thought on the radical autonomy of the will. And we already said it. It's from his very early days in Oxford as a young curate and university chaplain. But arguably, now, Occam is the more likely precursor of Kant's subtle and arbitrary voluntarism. Now, let's define a couple of key concepts here. Voluntarism comes from voluntas, the will. In general, for the scholastics, it's any theory that gives the will prominence. The use of voluntarism here is not a mask for self-will. Newman was so strong in defining that, especially in his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, what a true conscience is, and not a mask for self-will. So the use of voluntarism is not a mask for self-will, but in the Scotistic and Newmanian sense of a profoundly personal quest for truth, the most noble exercise of the will and intellect. And the key is that Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman are pilgrim scholars who support a principle of holiness, rather than a reduction to an anti-holiness principle, or posture that virtue is meaningless and vice and sin are morally neutral. Oh, that's the terminology today. It's all morally neutral. The problem they avoid is reducing the human struggle for holiness by the knowledge of and free practice of virtue to overcome vice. Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman recognize the desire for cultivating genuine virtue and to overcome self-will, sin, and vice as a lifelong struggle. The Christian believes in help from the gift of grace to reach holiness. And here's where I turn to the original analysis of Professor Cyril O'Regan from Notre Dame on the problem of liberal Christianity, with its anti-holiness stance as rooted in the 17th century. Now, in his early life at Oxford, Blessed Newman perceives that there's a problem, intuitively avoids it, and spends his life growing in certitude. He answers in the grammar of assent how you can believe what you cannot understand and believe what you cannot absolutely prove. And O'Regan's view is that the only right reasoned answer is to choose to live the gospel message to be perfect as the Heavenly Father is perfect. His argument is drawn from a selection of Blessed Newman's writings and serves as an X-ray of the problem of liberal Christianity, at once seductive, as it appears to be, freeing, but clearly modernist. Modernism, in this context, means an ideology which uses naturalistic evolutionary philosophy and arbitrary historical criticism in such a manner as to attempt to change Catholic doctrine in the manner that it can never be changed. The problem of modernism was so complex and seductive that St. Pius X required clerics and seminary professors and religious superiors to take an oath against modernism. Well, Regan's critical thought clarifies the seductive problem of modernism, perhaps more seductive today, because the oath against modernism itself is too often perceived as antiquated and unnecessary by those who, I dare say, and I've heard this, who fail to understand its salutary meaning. But they ought to, especially if they have responsibilities in seminaries. Curiously, both Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman were accused of being modernists and voluntarists, meaning that they were rationalists with an arbitrary view of the will. That's an earthquake of a statement. The direct answer is that they were neither modernists nor voluntarists. Private judgment was never the ultimate authority in their decisions about faith and reason. Conceivably, one of the easiest ways to understand Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman, what they hold about modernism and voluntarism, is in their teaching about intuition and certitude in relation to the unchanging character of revelation and dogma, the main theme in this essay. And one gets more than a hint in Blessed Newman's columns that called the Tamworth Reading Room collection, written as an Anglican in 1841. Blessed Newman sums up his respect for the intrinsically excellent and noble scientific pursuits in liberal education which were in the era, including Lockean and Kantian thought. And he wrote, "Knowledge does not occupy, does not form the mind. That apprehension of the unseen is the only known principle capable of subsuing moral evil, educating the multitude, and organizing society. And that whereas man is born for action, action flows not from the inferences, but from impressions, not from reasonings, but from faith." And that quote is so vitally important because we were asking that question. We began with Father Ford in our first session. How do we move from inference to real assent? That is so critical a question, lest we fall into a rationalist trap. Clearly, the role of faith for Blessed Newman pinpoints his problem with modernism and its corollary voluntarism. His knowledge of intuition and certitude helps him to recognize the weaknesses in the increasingly secularized thought of the 19th century. It's an end run around or rejection of the unchanging character of revelation and dogma. Blessed Scotus knew this attempt in its early 13th century Joachimite or pre-Hegelian form. Remember Joachim of Fiore, and his ideas were picked up, unfortunately, by several Franciscans, and that was the biggest problem, the biggest headache, I think, for St. Bonaventure as Minister General. He had to weed out the virus of Joachimism, but it's a pre-Hegelian form. So that virus returns again under Hegel, and that's what Professor O'Regan writes about quite convincingly, to me anyway, the neo-Hegelian problems that are subtly underneath our day. Blessed Newman knew the mechanics of the problem of modernism and voluntarism in those who espouse private judgment and scientific pursuits in the place of ethical training. So the impact of Joachimite and neo-Hegelian thought is reflected in the following remark of Pope Benedict to the Archbishop Rowan Williams of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace in London recently. Quote, "On the one hand, the surrounding culture is growing ever more distant from its Christian roots, despite a deep and widespread hunger for spiritual nourishment. On the other hand, the increasingly multicultural dimension of society, particularly marked in this country, the UK, that applies to us too, brings with it the opportunity to encounter other religions. For as Christians, this opens up the possibility of exploring, together with members of other religious traditions, ways of bearing witness to the transcendent dimension of the human person and the universal call to holiness." And that was an underlying theme as I listened to the wonderful lecture from our keynote speaker, Sister Mary Beth Ingham, last evening. Now, as our time moves along, I simply will underscore the contribution of Blessed Scotus to what was there a bit earlier, but his fine-tuning of the formal distinction between will and intellect. What I would like to do is underscore the theme that Professor Noon spoke about, the use of ratio, use of reason. Father Peter also mentioned that, how ratio was understood. And I'm going to then move to page 10, towards the top, where Newman uses and understood ratio and understood the way idea was being used. And idea for him was closer to the ratio in medieval thought. This is an extremely important connection then to show between Scotus and Newman. And here's how he plays this out. And I want to make sure that the quote gets to the audience, not only this audience, but those who are watching us at home. In his acceptance speech in 1879, upon receiving the honor of being called a cardinal, he began talking about the intentions in his heart. And remember, what's underneath this is he knows to alter the type corrupts the type. Here's what he's saying. In a long course of years, I've made many mistakes. I've nothing of that high perfection which belongs to the writings of the saints, that error cannot be found in them. But that I trust that I may claim all through what I've written is this: an honest intention, an absence of private ends, a temper of obedience, a willingness to be corrected, a dread of error, a desire to serve Holy Church, and through divine mercy a fair measure of success. And he continues, for 30, 40, 50 years I've resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism in religion. And that is the integral connection to the problem of the anti-dogmatic, anti-sacramental, anti-holiness stance that Newman resisted with all his might. And he continued, quote, never did Holy Church need champions against it more sorely than now, when, alas, it's an error spreading as a snare the whole earth. In my view here, Newman implies that the error has a Kantian form with Lockean roots. His love for the Church and her future prompted him to renew the protest. So he continues his protest in that Biglietto speech, they call it. Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another. And this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily. It's inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous. And it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy. So Newman carries this criticism of the Lockean view further, a gentle reminder to those of us living in the post-Vatican II age, because our intention is to put into practice the authentic spirit of the Council, that the successes of the ecumenical movement are the work of prayer and engagement with doctrine under the influence of the Holy Spirit and mediation of Mary. Now Newman continues in that address. Devotion is not necessarily founded on faith. Men may go to Protestant churches and to Catholic, may get good from both and belong to neither. They may fraternize together in spiritual thoughts and feelings without having any views at all of doctrine in common or seeing the need of them. And then Newman adds his critique of a problem that's constant, that of private judgment, which has a Lockean Kantian form, meaning the arbitrary delineation of revealed truths as strong or weak, and a subtle arbitrary voluntarism. Quote again from Newman. Since then religion is so personal a peculiarity and so private a possession, we must of necessity ignore it in the intercourse of man with man. If a man puts on a new religion every morning, what's that to you? It's as impertinent to think about a man's religion as about his sources of income or his management of his family. Religion is in no sense the bond of society, unquote from Newman. And Newman concludes includes the result of such a relativistic mindset. In the place of religion and supernatural sanctions, philosophers and politicians are bent to solve the problems of law and order without the aid of Christianity. The search is for great working principles to take the place of religion. And Newman summarizes this way, unquote, religion is a private luxury, which a man may have if he will, but which of course he must pay for, and which he must not obtrude upon others, or indulge into their annoyance, unquote. Then he concludes with a powerful word. This great apostasia, another way of making this point, I submit, is to repeat, to alter the type corrupts the type. Only preservation of type is valid for Blessed Newman as a note of true development of doctrine. That means that liberalism in religion corrupts religion. Now I'm going to take the liberty to move towards the conclusion, in a matter of time, and that we will find on page, right ahead here to page 18. Both scholars, Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman, who labored in England, exemplify the adage, be Catholic, be intellectual, be holy. That's the motivation to reply to the question of the day. How did the radical autonomy of the will, with its subtle and arbitrary voluntarism, develop? The answer, I submit, is found in addressing freedom and how the will is defined in relation to the intellect. One has to be ever mindful of the ontological change, the weakening of the human person due to sin, but not the loss of causal power, practical potential, and freedom. And that is Scotus. So that's where we're drawing that from. Sister Mary Beth underscored that too in her address last evening. The question raised by Pope Benedict at his audience on Blessed Scotus in July of this year reaches out to the answer of Blessed Scotus and Blessed Newman. So in the next part of the essay that I tend to work on, this is the middle part of 3 that make up one essay. The next part, the scientific form and real assent of Blessed Newman and Blessed Scotus, will compare the symmetry between Christian wisdom and the wisdom that is the origin and the goal of all science. And so, Father Ford, that's what I submit, is that by making that statement, it really brings us back to the very beginning of your first talk, which inaugurated this Newman-Scotus Symposium. The milieu for further research of intuition and certitude remains the same. The 3 approaches just outlined. The first approach is the structure provided by Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. We say that with great respect. We need to know it. We can't just presume it or presume that we know it. We've got to understand it. We've got to know how to drive the car, Aristotelian and Thomistic. And the second is that of Occam, Hume, and Kant. Occam is an innovator in relation to Blessed Scotus, ever so brief a comment. Hume promotes the examination of one's feelings, experience, and Kant promotes the examination of one's reason. The third approach is that of St. Bonaventure and Blessed Scotus. The Franciscans advocate interiorization in order to keep reason, logic, linked to reality. So my very last paragraph. Newman and Scotus research builds on the hypothesis that Blessed Newman reflects the thought of St. Bonaventure and Blessed Scotus and fits into the third approach more than into the other 2 approaches. And as we've listened to Father Peter, I think that there's where we sort of were pulled by the very strong magnet to see why we're using that approach. How one understands intuition and certitude is the pivotal point. To repeat, and this, we've just got to live with this and put this under our pillow, so to speak, the theory of divine illumination of St. Bonaventure and the incomparable formulation of divine illumination in logical form by Blessed Scotus is the light guiding all our thought. The univocity of the concept of being is not a pure logical construct first, but a unique formulation to keep logic linked to reality, to being, to what is. And we share being with God. We are finite. We share with the infinite being. Blessed Newman's illative sense, a faculty of judging, is integrally connected to the thought of St. Bonaventure and Blessed Scotus on making judgments, especially about the existence of God, which flees in full flight, echoing the words of Bonaventure's Itinerarium. It flees in full flight from skepticism and rationalism. The radical and arbitrary autonomy of the will, with freedom as its ultimate end, freedom that would reduce God to an idea or a concept alone. We don't fall in love with just ideas or concepts. What a horrible life that would be. But the radical and arbitrary autonomy of the will with freedom as its ultimate end, freedom that would reduce God to an idea or a concept alone, not substance, is separated from reality, nothing less than the dark night of the senses. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Father Ed. As before, we're going to have questions, and there was a very wide-ranging paper. We don't want to take a moment to collect our thoughts, but to entertain questions, and Father Ed. Okay.
Professor Christie.
Thank you very much, Father Ed. I just have one reminiscence of something Aristotle said. I believe it is in his Physics, which I'd just like you to comment on in light of your paper. I believe he says in the Physics, when he's discussing nature or ontology, he says he examines what is the nature of the human, and he says typically and I'm of course paraphrasing. He says typically we think of nature as static, what a thing is, but he says the human has within it a principle of change, and that presents a different position. So I was just wondering, in light of what you've said, what you've written, if you could deal with that Aristotelian point.
Thank you for that. It's spot on, as they say in England. And if you turn to page 16, and we had to, for the sake of time, we had to compress a bit, and the anthropological considerations that are prompted in Scotus, that is the short answer. Okay, that is the short answer. What does Blessed Scotus do with his anthropology? If I may, I'm going to turn to 16, because there's where the fuller answer is, okay? Blessed Scotus' anthropology, easiest to understand if we contemplate the perfect will of Mary in union with God. Okay, her perfectly free and human acceptance to be Mother of God. And here's where the article of Benedetto Ippolito, which we have on sale in our bookshop, if I may make a plug for that, because it is superb. And that whole collection of the conference that took place in Durham in September 2008, absolutely superb collection that we ought to have. I mean, I have no hesitation saying, I'm not trying to be a bookseller here. I just know what went into that. And I know how important this answer of Benedetto Ippolito is to the question you're raising, because it's also what we haven't done here, and what will appear in the next part of this essay, which will also, when we put all of these papers together, we'll have them in perfect order, is we have a marvelous theologian of ours, philosopher from our Pontifical Academy in Rome, called the Seraphicum, Father Orlando Todisco. He's written extensively on Scotus and on freedom. He raises very, very appealing questions on nature, just what you're asking, Bob, okay? He raises that, and he has a marvelous theory of how Scotus answers it. But we can't just buy it and say, well, it's a new idea, let's just jump on the bandwagon and go with it because it must be right. We want to be careful about the problem that Toyota has. You know, they're recalling millions and millions of cars. We want to be careful about that recall. So no, that's what our responsibility is, to be cautious, to see all the sides. So it's a caution in terms of answering your question. And I hope I'm not trying to evade it, because there's something in what Father Todisco has written there about creative liberty that I find extremely powerful, but it's got to be interpreted in that bracket of the interiorization that St. Bonaventure and Blessed Scotus teach us. If it becomes separate, that my creative liberty is my personal autonomy alone, then you see immediately the last 2 days, even if we didn't know anything about Kant when we walked in here, that's a Kantian subtle use of arbitrary will. Okay? Is that something of leading you towards that answer? It's there a little bit fuller in the anthropological considerations, and then we promise to unravel it a bit more through Father Orlando Todisco's article, which is we're translating. Father Martin helped translate it. We're fine-tuning it now, and we intend to have that as part of the proceedings here, so that we can engage that. And I think we'll keep this question very much in front of us, so that we can come right back to it and say that it was raised by Professor Christie from DeVry University. Is that a help?
Yeah.
Not an evasive answer?
I'm going to read through this section.
Okay.
Thank you, Father.
In other words, all right.
Other questions?
All right. Well, if there aren't more questions, I'm going to just for 1 second, since we've got about 2 minutes, if I may take that. I put a postscript here, which are about 2 paragraphs, and I'd like this postscript sort of to be like the ski slope. You start down, and I just wish I were an Olympic skier that could just make that long jump, and land without tumbling all over. But here's the postscript, and it's meant to be the carrot and the stick, trying to get you to continue to think along these lines, so that when we leave here, we're still working and doing our homework. Postscript here. Blessed Scotus anticipated the problem that is captured by the perceived dynamic today, and Cyril O'Regan uses this so often. The game is rigged against Christianity. Now, he's not being negative. He's not a person who's a pessimist. He's not a extremist in any way. He is just the opposite. It's a very keen intellectual analysis and an observation of what's going on in the world. And that's what I saw Newman do all his life. That's why he called himself a controversialist, because I engage the issues of the day. And I don't like my hands as a controversialist to be tied, even by ecclesiastical authority. It's interesting he said that. He's blessed. And who beatified him but the Pope? He understood what Newman was trying to say by tying the hands of a controversialist. So we have no intention either to tying the hands of any of the controversies that we may have helped to bring to the surface. So as I understand this dynamic, again, the game is rigged. It's an outgrowth of a post-Lockean ethos structured on the distinctions that Locke made about being a strong or a weak logic. Both terms are Lockean. They refer to the relative firmness in the relation of an inference. Again, Father Ford, to the beginning of your first talk, the relation of an inference to its premises. In other words, for Locke, that there is a God is based on strong logic. That the Son of God was human and divine is based on weak logic. That's Locke. Blessed Newman lived with the consequences of this Lockean ethos, or this nascent rigging, if you would, in his day. And the problem of the Lockean ethos is that it tends to reduce objective truth to little or nothing of much value. And Pope Benedict knows this. We look at his and listen to his catechesis. He knows this. So in spite of recognizing the benefits since the Enlightenment, and no one will deny that, Pope Benedict knows the game is rigged. For example, he sees this in the opposition to what the Church teaches, even to the existence of the soul and immortality. Providentially, he set the table for dialogue, I think, about a most sensitive issue, the liberty of will in relation to intellect. He's not saying in that July audience this past summer about Scotus, he's not saying, I'm giving you the answer. He has set the table, and he has asked of Dominicans especially, and Franciscans, to do that hard work to answer this question, the relationship of liberty of will in relation to the intellect. So then that's my conclusion. The careful study of the philosophical, theological, anthropological approaches of St. Thomas Aquinas and Blessed Scotus, 1 and 3 in our essay, will help Newman-Scotus research reach a consensus in continuity with tradition without unwittingly falling into the rationalist trap or yielding to subtle arbitrary voluntarism. Thank you very much.